Most action films show their spectacle openly: fire, dust, and the myth of heroism unfolding in plain sight. But some carry a second life, buried deep beneath the frames. A life shaped not by stunt choreography or visual effects, but by landscapes chosen in whispers, negotiated behind closed doors, and filmed under skies that were never meant to appear in any production log. These films were crafted on land where authority shifted quietly, where borders were more suggestion than certainty, and where a camera's presence could turn from harmless to dangerous in a heartbeat. Studios polished their official accounts, presenting orderly filming locations that satisfied investors and reassured audiences. But the truth often lingered outside those clean narratives. Crews found themselves confronting checkpoints that didn't exist on maps, working under the supervision of officials who asked no questions and expected none in return. Some were told to keep moving if they heard distant engines. Others were advised to destroy any frames that captured too much of the world around them. And so, behind the glossy surface of these 15 action films lies a hidden geography, a patchwork of forbidden zones, unstable territories, and conflict-adjacent terrain. The tension that thrums through their imagery isn't only cinematic, it is the echo of real danger pressing at the edges of every shot. The landscapes feel raw because they were raw. The unease feels real because it was real. And the secrecy persists because revealing everything might pull these films into political storms far bigger than the stories they tell. Tonight, we trace the outlines of that hidden map. These are 15 action movies filmed in places chosen not for beauty or convenience, but because secrecy was the only way they could exist at all. Fakt jedna. Rambo 3 1988. The studio insisted the production never strayed beyond safe, regulated areas. Yet the land that appeared behind the actors had a harshness too specific to ignore a dryness shaped by conflict, mountains carved by decades of unrest, and the unmistakable hue of soil rarely seen outside regions brushing against Afghanistan. Crew members later hinted that some shooting days began before dawn not for artistic lighting, but to avoid being noticed by groups whose movements were unpredictable. What looked like a straightforward desert action sequence concealed a fragile dance with geography that carried its own warnings. A few crew recalled instructions delivered quietly. Don't wander past marked stones, don't film anything with metallic glints on hilltops, don't ask about aircraft that passed overhead without identifiers. These weren't standard filming notes, they were survival notes. The studio's public denial stayed firm, protecting distribution deals and political neutrality. But fragments of photographs and leaked testimonies suggest the cameras edged dangerously close to territory that no production should have been anywhere near. The realism that pulses through Rambo III wasn't merely the work of set designers. It was shaped by the uneasy breath of land, scarred by an actual war happening just beyond the frame. Fact 2. The Delta Force. 1986. The film unfolds with the certainty of classic 80 seconds action cinema, but the production behind it carried none of that confidence. Certain sequences were filmed in areas so close to the Lebanon border that the environment itself became a character wind carrying distant cracks, soldiers watching from ridges, and checkpoints appearing where no one expected them. Crew members described the strange duality of hearing explosions they weren't paid to create. Security advisors avoided dramatic warnings, but their tone said enough. Keep equipment unmarked, follow the convoy precisely, and never assume a quiet valley is empty. Evading attention wasn't an artistic choice. It was a necessity. Some of the most iconic desert shots were captured quickly, almost breathlessly, before anyone had time to question why unfamiliar vehicles were present in the area. Public-facing interviews clung to a sanitized explanation. The entire production took place within Israeli boundaries, but those who saw the raw landscapes recognized details that contradicted the official story: rock formations and horizon lines tied to zones still wrapped in political sensitivity. The Delta Force delivered fiction, but the ground beneath its production carried its own unspoken reality. Fact 3. Red Scorpion. 1988. On screen, the film portrays a fictional African struggle. Off-screen, the crew stepped into a region where tension simmered behind every government-approved smile. The production didn't operate like a typical movie shoot, it moved like a supervised visit. Military personnel lingered just out of frame, not as part of the cast, but as uninvited guardians, ensuring the crew remained within invisible boundaries. Those wearing uniforms in the film sometimes weren't pretending, They were real soldiers filling in as extras, their familiarity with weapons far too natural to fake. The crew recalled being discouraged from exploring local towns or speaking to civilians without translation. Even scouting locations required permission from individuals whose authority wasn't entirely clear. Years later, critics questioned whether the production had unknowingly aligned itself with a regime under international scrutiny. The studio responded by sidestepping the discussion entirely, offering a simple narrative about logistical convenience. But those who carried the cameras still remember the weight in the air, the sense that every captured image had to pass through an unspoken filter of political caution. Red Scorpion aimed to capture intensity. It succeeded, but not only because of its story, the land itself carried a quiet, pressing threat that no script could imitate. Fact Shtiri. American Ninja Tisoch Devetsto Petinosem Desit. At first glance, the film seems like a colorful martial arts adventure shot on a relaxed tropical base, but the reality beneath that surface was far leaner, far more cautious. The crew operated inside a Philippine zone where uncertainty hung in the air like humidity. Nights were rarely calm. Small bursts of sound drifted across the dark, the kind no sound designer could manufacture. The location wasn't merely remote. It sat beside territories where armed groups shifted their positions unpredictably. Cast members remembered being told not to wander past certain fences, even during off hours. Vehicles transporting camera gear sometimes moved with company quiet escorts who avoided conversation. Some extras wore uniforms that reflected more than costume design. They were borrowed directly from men with real experience, real weapons, and real histories. Studio press releases used vague language about on-location filming in the Philippines, leaving out everything that mattered. No map was shown, no mention of nearby conflict was made, and no hint surfaced that filming schedules were arranged around the pulse of a region that never fully slept. American Ninja appeared light-hearted on screen, but behind the lens it lived a different truth, one written in tension, caution, and landscapes that couldn't be fully controlled. Fact 5. McBain, 1991. The jungle setting of McBain carries an unspoken weight because it wasn't chosen for convenience, it was chosen for authenticity, even if that authenticity came with risk. Parts of the production took shape on the fringes of Colombia's troubled territories, places where shifting alliances determined which roads were safe and which weren't. Crew members described days when smoke on the horizon meant a detour, not a scenic detail. Their guides communicated danger through silence more than words, steering the film unit away from areas that weren't stable today. Even seasoned actors felt the environment settling into them, the humidity, the unease, the knowledge that beyond the trees, lives were unfolding with stakes far higher than any script. One cinematographer later said that every time he adjusted his lens, he felt as though the forest itself was watching. The studio never addressed this complexity. They simply highlighted the exotic landscape, redirecting attention away from the delicate realities on the ground. Yet the intensity captured in those frames owed its existence to more than performance. It came from the nervous rhythm of a production that brushed dangerously close to real unrest, relying on instinct and local whispers to navigate each day. McBain staged a fictional uprising. The world around it, however, never needed staging. Fact 6. Death Before Dishonor, 1987. The dry, sun-bleached locations in the film were presented as generic Middle Eastern stand-ins, but the actual environment was far too specific to be anonymous. The crew worked in a sensitive sector of Jordan where political scrutiny existed even if no one spoke of it openly. Permissions were granted under layers of discretion documents that pointed to one district while the real work happened in another. Cast and crew recalled daily briefings that sounded less like filmmaking instructions and more like quiet caution. Avoid turning cameras toward certain ridges. Do not capture military activity. Do not stray from the approved sectors. Some nights, lights from distant patrols flickered across the dunes, hinting at movement unrelated to the film. Sound technicians frequently battled interference from live fire drills that bled faintly through the air. Official studio notes remained matter-of-fact, framing the production as straightforward desert filmmaking. But behind that simplicity lay a network of agreements shaped by diplomacy rather than artistry. The team navigated their work like guests walking on borrowed ground, fully aware that too much visibility could complicate relationships far outside the entertainment industry. Death Before Dishonor portrayed covert action on screen. But the environment it depended on required a quiet, careful choreography of its own, one built on trust, silence, and strategic restraint. Fact 7. The Beast of War. 1988. The production's official explanation emphasized control and safety, but the terrain in the background carried a stubborn truth more difficult to disguise. The ridges were too familiar, the soil too marked by conflict, and the silence between takes felt charged rather than calm. Those valleys weren't merely locations, they were scars left behind by a war that had not fully faded. Crew members later described strange pauses during filming, moments when the ground seemed to tremble before sound arrived, vibrations that hinted at live munitions echoing from miles away. Guides avoided direct answers about who occupied the land beyond each ridge. "Don't film past that point," they said, "just trust me." Their warnings carried a weight that no script could replicate. Occasionally, reels containing footage of distant structures disappeared during processing, replaced with safer alternatives. The studio credited the film's realism to skilled direction and practical effects, but those who worked the set felt the truth at their backs. The environment's authenticity came from proximity to a conflict that was still breathing. The Beast of War captured the machinery of war inside a tank, but the unease that permeates its imagery belongs to the terrain itself, a land that never stopped remembering what happened there. Fact 8. Rules of Engagement. 2000. The film promoted itself as a tightly controlled production, carefully staged, carefully lit, and comfortably distanced from real geopolitical heat. Yet pieces of its visual backbone were collected in places where cameras were anything but welcome. A small, discreet team slipped into areas near Yemen where foreign equipment attracted immediate suspicion. They traveled lightly, their gear disguised as ordinary photography kits, their movements deliberate and brief. The streets they captured had an unmistakable tension. Corners held shadows longer than expected. People watched too closely, as though weighing possibilities. Crew members later recalled that they never stayed in one spot long enough to adjust their framing twice. Lingering meant drawing questions, and questions were risk. The footage they gathered had the atmospheric density the film needed, but every second of it was earned under pressure. Even years later, the studio sidestepped inquiries about how certain visuals had been achieved. The official line credited international scouting, a phrase vague enough to erase the anxiety behind those frames, but those who collected the material still remember the silence between footsteps, the unsaid warnings, and the feeling that they were being evaluated from windows they couldn't see. Rules of Engagement tells a story about truth on trial. Behind the camera, truth was something the crew could only handle in fragments. Fact 9. The Killing Fields. 1984. The film's power lies in its raw emotional weight, but part of that gravity comes from where the camera stood near the edge of a border still echoing with the aftermath of violence. Though officially framed as a production based in Thailand, the terrain bore traces unmistakably tied to Cambodia's wounded landscape. The earth felt restless, as if it hadn't fully recovered from the trauma the film sought to portray. Crew accounts spoke of winds carrying distant, abrupt sounds, sharp ripples that no microphone was meant to capture. Extras didn't merely act. Many lived the very history depicted, lending a presence that was both grounding and overwhelming. Their silent reactions to certain locations revealed truths no script could instruct. Authorities kept a watchful eye, urging the production to avoid specific hillsides or structures still tied to military operations. Journalists who pressed too hard about filming proximity to the border received polite but empty answers. The full truth was left buried under layers of diplomacy and caution. The Killing Fields earned acclaim for its realism. But that realism wasn't just crafted, it was lived. Absorbed from ground still holding memories the world struggled to confront. Fact 10. Tears of the Sun. 2003. The official narrative placed the entire production in Hawaii, safely distant from any real-world volatility. But fragments of testimony from crew members reveal another layer, a quiet expedition into parts of Nigeria that carried a constant undercurrent of risk. A small team traveled with stripped-down gear, coached to move like observers rather than filmmakers. Their mission was simple: capture textures the Pacific Islands couldn't provide, then vanish before anyone questioned their presence. Those who went described a place heavy with tension, where the air seemed to vibrate with the kind of alertness found in regions negotiating uneasy calm. Guides warned them to avoid drawing attention, to ignore questions from strangers, and to pack their equipment at the first sign of unusual activity. More than once, they abandoned a shot mid-setup because the atmosphere shifted in ways they couldn't quite describe. Eyes watching from tree lines, sudden silences that didn't feel natural. The production never acknowledged these excursions. Press kits spoke confidently of Hawaiian landscapes carrying the film's emotional weight. Yet in the final cut, certain shots bear unmistakable details: plants, soil, shadows, not found anywhere near the Pacific. These elements exist like whispers threaded through the film, hinting at a journey the studio chose not to document. Tears of the Sun presented chaos and moral resolve, but woven beneath it is the faint imprint of a crew that stepped into a place where unpredictability was not just narrative, it was their reality. Fact 11. Behind Enemy Lines, 2001. Audiences saw a polished depiction of a pilot lost in hostile territory. What they didn't see was how closely the production mirrored that premise. Several key visuals were captured near real border regions in Eastern Europe, terrain watched by military forces whose presence was never formally acknowledged. The team responsible for these shots traveled under strict routing instructions, guided through back roads designed to avoid attention from those who monitored the area. Helicopter pilots recalled receiving cryptic directions: stay below certain altitudes, avoid specific coordinates, and expect no answers if communications went silent. Camera operators spoke of being rushed through setups because the landscape felt too exposed. The raw footage, when viewed later, displayed unmistakable features linked to zones the studio claimed they never approached. When journalists pressed about the intensity of the imagery, studio representatives attributed it to excellent location research. The phrase masked a deeper truth: the crew had captured glimpses of ground shaped by real tension, not just careful production design. The risk wasn't theatrical. It lay just beyond the borders the team wasn't supposed to cross. Behind Enemy Lines blurred the line between fiction and proximity. The story it told on screen was mirrored, quietly, by the route its cameras dared to take. Fakt 12, Neve Seals, 1990. The film marketed itself on adrenaline and authenticity, yet one of its most striking elements came from a brief, concealed trip into a Lebanese coastal sector unsettled by recent conflict. The crew that undertook this journey operated with an almost military precision: no visible branding, minimal equipment, and an understanding that asking fewer questions meant safer progress. They moved along battered streets where buildings echoed the weight of what had unfolded only months earlier. Footage was captured quickly, instinctively, as if the environment allowed only narrow windows of opportunity. A few crew members later recalled sounds drifting from distant neighborhoods, sharp, metallic, and unmistakably real reminders that the area hadn't fully stepped away from its past. The studio avoided acknowledging the excursion, using broad terms like Mediterranean settings to describe the shoot. The truth lived only in the memories of the handful who walked those streets under the guidance of locals who knew which corners to avoid. Their work left behind images that carried a gravity no constructed set could produce. Navy SEALs showcased daring missions on screen, but the quiet mission behind the camera, swift, discreet, and never officially recognized, was just as tense. Fact 13. The Dogs of War, 1980. The film claimed to portray a fictional uprising, yet the land beneath the crew's feet carried the weight of a reality far too complex to fit into any screenplay. Much of the production unfolded inside a Central African region where political power shifted like sand in the wind. The crew worked in an atmosphere that felt unsettled, as though the environment itself was studying them. Extras dressed as soldiers blurred the line between performance and lived experience. Some handled their weapons with a familiarity that didn't come from rehearsal, and their silence during breaks revealed more truth than any dialogue in the script. Local fixers urged the crew to respect boundaries they never mapped out. Warnings delivered in tones that implied stepping even a few meters too far might invite the wrong attention. When developing footage later showed glimpses of structures associated with active military facilities, those reels conveniently disappeared. The studio chalked it up to damaged film stock, but people present during the shoot knew better. The authenticity that seeped into the movie was born from the ground itself, a place carrying conflict, uncertainty, and the kind of tension that can't be manufactured. The Dogs of War depicted danger, but the real danger was the quiet kind, the kind that lingers just out of frame. Fact 14. Missing in Action, $1,984. The movie sold its setting as a simple stretch of Thai jungle, but the materials that survived from the shoot tell a more complicated story. Some of the atmospheric footage, the low-hanging mist, the dense tree lines, the uneasy stillness came from areas dangerously close to the Laos border. It was a region shaped by years of conflict, a place where the past hadn't fully settled. A minimal crew ventured there, instructed to work quickly and to treat silence as a warning rather than a convenience. They recalled sudden changes in the mood of their guides, abrupt shifts that signaled it was time to pack up and move without debate. The jungle felt alive in ways beyond wildlife. It carried the memory of people who had fled, fought, or vanished there. Producers later stripped all identifying details from location records. "Shot in Thailand" became a blanket phrase covering everything, smoothing over the jagged truth. Yet the film's atmosphere tells on itself. The tension woven into the imagery, the unease, the weight is too sharp, too authentic to come from a place untouched by history. Missing in action aimed to evoke conflict. What the audience didn't know was that the camera stood closer to it than anyone admitted. Fact 15, Act of Valor, 2012. The film's branding revolved around authenticity, boasting real operators and real tactics. But the authenticity ran deeper than viewers were ever meant to know. Several reconnaissance-style segments were shot in parts of the Philippines, where insurgent movements lingered just out of sight. The crew that handled this footage moved like a small tactical unit, silent, mobile, and intensely aware of their surroundings. They traveled with unmarked equipment, following paths suggested by local contacts who spoke cautiously about which areas were quiet for now. Filming sessions were brief, instinct-driven, punctuated by moments when the jungle seemed to shift from watchful to hostile. Crew members recalled a constant awareness that they were guests in a place where attention could be dangerous. The studio avoided addressing any of this. Their public statements emphasized collaboration and global locations, leaving out the part where the team stepped into zones that insurance paperwork never would have approved. The resulting visuals carry a rawness that can't be faked, a texture borrowed directly from a landscape shaped by tension. Act of Valor told stories of covert operations. Off-screen, the production ventured into a small covert mission of its own, recorded only in the footage it left behind. Bonus fact: the footage that shouldn't exist. In a locked cabinet deep inside a studio archive sits a metal container with no official registration and no accompanying paperwork. Archivists say it arrived during a chaotic period of restructuring, slipped into the collection without a signature, without a sender, and without context. What rests inside is a series of images that feel too precise to be accidental and too dangerous to be acknowledged. A convoy moving through a sun-bleached corridor of desert, a fortified structure with no flag, no insignia, and no trace in public records. A camera operator's shadow flickering briefly across jagged rock formations that don't match any documented filming location. Attempts to identify the footage led only to more questions. Soil tests matched regions locked behind political restrictions during the year the film strip was processed. Horizon lines aligned with a disputed border where foreign crews would never have been granted passage. Even the timestamp embedded in the celluloid contradicted the date stamped on its storage container. Every clue pointed to a place where cameras would have been confiscated or worse had they been discovered. No department claims ownership, no director recognizes the frames, and no one can explain how the reel survived long enough to reach the archive without being intercepted. The few who have watched it describe an unease that settles slowly, as though the images weren't meant to be observed by outsiders. Maybe it belonged to a second unit that pushed too far. Maybe it was captured by someone testing boundaries they were never meant to cross. Or maybe it's evidence of a moment Hollywood quietly erased. Whatever its origin, the reel sits untouched, its silence louder than any story it contains. Tell us which moment reshaped the way you see these films, and which hidden location you believe still holds a story waiting to surface. If there's another action movie whose buried truth you want uncovered, share it below. Your insights guide the next investigation, and your theories help illuminate the corners Hollywood keeps in the dark. Subscribe if you want to follow these deep dives into the unseen, and stay with us as we continue mapping the shadows behind action cinema's most secret origins.